Good, folks. Welcome to our FEDSAS online session today. My name is Paul Renken. I'm based in the lovely Midlands. And today we are going to be speaking primarily, we hope, to educators who have been drawn to the session to find out a little bit more about their responsibility with regards to the POPIA Act. Today I have to start off by saying that we have a birthday girl amongst our midst, and I will straight away wish Janae happy birthday for her birthday. I'm not allowed to discuss how old, but yeah, really fantastic, Janae. Have a wonderful birthday. Thank you very much for giving up your time. Maybe you aren't in that generation that take a holiday on their birthday. I know there is a generation that start thinking like that, but thank you very much for spending this special day with us. Hopefully you can celebrate. Hopefully definitely yesterday's hoax about the bottle stores closing was just a hoax. So yeah, Vicky Vanky vanmiddag to celebrate will really be great. So happy birthday and welcome everybody else. I see we're nearly at not quite at our full numbers. We've had quite a lot of registrations, but obviously we'll see how the process runs through from there. For those of you that haven't been involved in the processes before, there is a Q&A box. You'll see it down below. If you wouldn't mind using that to ask us questions. You will also see the chat box. If I could ask you just to try and avoid that. We've got a panel of people working in the background helping answer questions as they come through. And if it goes in the Q&A box, we can track it a lot easier. So if you wouldn't mind typing something in there, and maybe now if you wouldn't mind just typing a word or two, let us know where you are. There's two types of people in South Africa at the moment, those ahead of the cold front and those behind the cold front. So let us know where you sit in the continuum of the weather that we are going to be experiencing over the next few days, and just drop a note in there just so we know there are people behind the names and the numbers that we see on the board in front of us here. We will be recording the session. Just so that you're aware, and that is probably also a POPI requirement that we just let you know we are recording the session, and the shared contents will be available and sent to everybody. And this is also a bit of a freebie for your CPTD points. So if you have registered with your SACE registration details, we will promote those through to the Council of Educators, and those can then be cashed in against your collection for your 150 points in every 3-year cycle. We will do what we can to get the points across to them. Sometimes things don't work out so well on their side, so excuse me from that. So please be aware, yeah, we will send the recording through to you and any other course content, and we will from time to time drop stuff in the chat box as well. I know Rihanna did earlier in the Afrikaans session, drop some stuff in from there, information, let me rather call it what it is, some information that we're discussing. The recording will also be sent through to you so that you can share it with your other colleagues and with other staff around in the process. There's a list of our provincial managers throughout the country. We have got a footprint in every province, and we've got presence in every province. So please get hold of the provincial managers with anything that's related to school management and governance. And then right at the bottom, you'll see Rian van den Berg's details. He's our Center for Technology Manager. He handles, no, I wouldn't say anything technology, because here we're sitting on technology as well. So anything that is maybe helpful to a school or schools looking for solutions, it is definitely worthwhile getting hold of him and say, does he know of this as a solution, and does he know where that may go from there? And with that, I'm going to hand over to Janae and ask her to proceed. And then if there are any questions, please drop them in the box. We'll handle them during the course of the session if we need to, or at the end of the session, we'll also present them to everybody to have a look. But sit back and enjoy the information. Bear in mind, we will send you the recording, so you don't have to make notes in a heavy manner. But yeah, let's gather this information and let's be responsible with how we're going to manage information going forward. Over to you, birthday girl.
There we go. Afternoon, Paul, and good afternoon to everyone. And Paul, thank you so much for the great and the wishes for my birthday. And I'll definitely take you on that glassy vein afterwards. But I think let's just finish with this session first. Yeah, today we're talking POPIA. So from FEDSAS side, we're in the process of presenting our series of POPIA webinars. Our first session, we had an introductory session about POPIA. Today we're going to talk specifically with regards to the personnel of the school and the educators of the school's obligations in terms of POPIA. As we know, there's not just a single person in the school who deals with all of the personal information. I have to say, I think most of the processing of personal information takes place on ground level. That would be our educators and our other staff working within the education sector. So it's really important to realize that POPIA is not just an act which now applies to the school as an entity. It does apply to the school as an entity, but we as individuals functioning within the schools now also have specific obligations within the POPIA Act. So yeah, it's very important to look at what those responsibilities and requirements are which POPIA requires of us. So yeah, I think just as an oversight, I think it's important to just understand, first of all, where the POPIA Act comes from. So it's not as of the 1st of July, which we had the right to privacy. No, the right to privacy is a right which is prescribed within our Constitution, and that's a right which we've had for a very, very long time. So what the POPIA Act now does, it goes about to prescribe to us, when we work with personal information, how do we realize this right to privacy, and how do we protect this right to privacy which specific persons has, and when we deal with the processing of information, how do we go about to protect those information? So even though the POPIA Act has only been signed into law from the 1st of July, we must keep in mind that we have always had a right to privacy, and we must still strive to protect that right. And then secondly, we must also remember, we do know we have a right to privacy, but on the other hand, a person also has a right to access information. And that's where the POPIA Act comes into play. Now, the POPIA Act is the Promotion of Access to Information Act. So I'm not going to go into detail with regards to the POPIA Act this afternoon, but I think it is important that we do keep in mind, even though we have the obligation to protect the right to privacy, we might sometimes be faced with a situation where someone would or might request access to information, and then we have to remember that that's a balancing act that we now have to ensure that we go about in doing, to see, is it reasonable for us to provide access to information. But throughout the presentation this afternoon, I'll point out to you when you may make information available, and when there is this obligation on you to protect someone's right to privacy. So yeah, what is the purpose of the POPIA Act? In one simple sentence, I can just refer you to the name of the act, the Protection of Personal Information Act. So what this act now does, it places an obligation on a responsible party, and the POPIA Act refers to a responsible party as a legal entity or as a natural person, that would be you and me, or the school as a legal entity, to put in place specific measures to ensure that when we process information, protect that specific personal information. So in a nutshell, that is the purpose of POPIA, and we all have a role to play in the realization of this purpose of POPIA. And then finally, just to also expand a bit, when we look at the processing of personal information, the POPIA regulates it by prescribing specific conditions to us. Now, there are 8 conditions prescribed by POPIA. I'm not going to list them and bore you with an academic lecture. I'd rather look at it from a practical point of view, but please just note that there are 8 conditions that we have to abide by. But as we go throughout, from a practical point of view, I'll point out to you what those conditions are. So when does POPIA apply? So there are 2 questions that we need to answer to understand whether POPIA applies to you and applies to your school. So the first question that we have to ask is whether you are a subject. So you would be a subject if you are a juristic or a natural person. I've already referred to it. You yourself, as there sitting as a human being, you're a natural person. And if you as a natural person or as a juristic person, being your school, is domiciled within South Africa, then the POPIA Act would definitely apply to you. Now, domiciled, meaning that you have an address within South Africa. So if you're processing information and if you have an address in South Africa, the POPIA Act would definitely apply to yourself. So I think we've sorted that, we've got that out of the way. There's no doubt that the POPIA Act would apply to your school. Just to point out to you, if you are processing information from South Africa, but you are domiciled outside of the borders of South Africa, then the POPIA Act could still apply to you. Due to the fact that you are processing personal information from a natural or juristic person who do reside within South Africa. To give you an example, for instance, let's take the Google Cloud or Google Drive as an example. We do know, and I believe, if not all of us, we do store information within the cloud. But let's say, for instance, the information center of Google is not is not within the borders of South Africa, but outside of the borders, then we can with certainty say that institution which lies outside of the borders will also have to comply with the conditions that POPIA sets for us. So that being said, let's just quickly look at how and what processing is. So the POPIA Act defines processing actually quite broadly, and it includes various actions that can be taken in relation to information. So it's not a limited definition. I've only given you a few examples there in that navy block, such as the collection of information or the receipt of it, the storage of it, or the way you go about when you use it. And that's just a few examples, but I can say with certainty that this definition is very broad, and it actually covers almost everything that you do with personal information. But if you want the detail on this definition, the Act is available on our FEDSAS website. Please go and have a look. But in most instances, our schools would process information through the collection, the receipt, the storage, the sharing thereof, and the use thereof. So I think we understand now, as schools and as educators within the schools, we do process personal information, so the POPIA Act does apply to us. But it's also important to understand what is personal information as described by the POPIA Act. Now, first of all, we have to distinguish between two categories of personal information. So first of all, we have just our plain personal information as defined by the Act, and then we have special personal information. Now, the first category, I'd like to define it with one word. That's our identifiers. So any information that you can use to identify a living or a natural person or a juristic person would be considered personal information. So if I can give you a couple of examples, myself being Johanne van der Merwe, whose birthday it is today. You all now have my birthday, you know my name, my surname. Any information that can identify me as a person is personal information. Interestingly, we're moving in and living in a digital era, so even your social media profile, what you post on your social media profile, an opinion I might have, is considered personal information. So the fact, if you sit next to a colleague in your staff room and you were to utter an opinion about your school principal's comb-over hairstyle, that's personal information. And if you strictly look at the implications and to what extent POPIA applies, then your colleague has to respect that opinion, and they can't just without your permission share and spread that opinion that you have, which you have about your school principal, just on a lighter note. And then secondly, it's very important to also consider what special personal information is. Now, I've specifically highlighted that we also have a full definition of what that is, but very importantly for our schools is personal information of children falls within this category. Other than personal information of children, we have your beliefs, your religious beliefs, whether you belong to a union or your political stance on who you support. There's a specific list as to what is regarded special personal information. Now, the reason why we have to consider this is because there are specific rules which applies to personal information. So as a rule of thumb is that we shouldn't be processing this specific information unless it is within the rules as prescribed by the POPIA Act, but we'll do that a bit later on. And then also very important, we know that we can have information in various formats. The days where we only have information and only receive information in writing is long gone. We now receive information via email, electronically, on audio. It might be that you are recording specific meetings. You will be photographing learners at your school, CCTV camera in your school. So it must be remembered our personal information can come in various formats. So if we want to share photographs, it is important to remember that that is considered personal information and that we have to abide by the rules and the prescripts of POPI. So yeah, I think very importantly, let's just also look at our information governance model, which we have in our schools. Just to give you a broader view and a broader picture of how it looks and who is responsible for what. You'll see right there at the top is our leader. This is our school principal. And in terms of the POPIA Act, our school principal will be our information officer. Now, next week, we have our information officer webinar session where we will specifically focus on what his or her duties are. I'm not going to go into detail on that today, but it's important to just take note that your school will now be appointing your information officer who will be your school principal. Your school principal can also delegate his or her functions to a deputy information officer. So it's important for those two categories to tune into our webinar next week. And then right here at the bottom, and I'd like to think at those three categories as the pillars of our information governance picture here. Because most of the processing of the information takes here right at the bottom. It's our non-educators and our educators. And when I refer to our support, it might be your school management team or your committees who mostly deals with the processing of personal information. So it's very important to just realize that the obligation to comply with POPI does not lie only with your information officer. We all have a role to play within our information governance within your school to ensure that we comply with POPI. So if there's an information breach within your school, we don't want them to start pointing fingers and say that we had a weak link within our governance structure. We want to make sure everyone is up to speed with what POPI requires, and everyone will abide by what the Act prescribes. So yes, yeah, the POPI Act states that the responsible party who processes information is responsible and must comply with the POPI Act. Very important also, we must remember that the processing of personal information of your learners and of your parents does not necessarily always stay within your school grounds and in your school buildings. We sometimes need to outsource those information. The D6 Connect app is an example of such a third party to whom you can outsource. So there are specific obligations in that regard. And then very importantly, we have our Department of Education. I believe that all of you are aware of FEDSAS. We have to register specific learners who are enrolled in your school with FEDSAS. You provide the marks of the learners through FEDSAS to the Department of Education. So we now have to start thinking smart. If we want to protect personal information, how do we go about when we outsource the information or when we send the information to the Department of Education? How do we do it responsibly? We don't just want to hand over a DVD or a USB stick with the information to the department, and now there is a risk of that being stolen. So we have to start thinking smart on how do we go about to ensure that with the submission of the information onto FEDSAS, how do we do that responsibly? Okay, so I want to start getting a bit practical. If we look at the permissible grounds for processing of personal information, the POPIA Act prescribes the following. And this is our normal personal information. We'll get to the special personal information. But the permissible grounds would be if you have consent of the data subject. Now, the Act refers to the data subject as the person to whom the information belongs. So your school's data subject would either be your parents, your learners, you yourselves as educators or personnel of the schools can also be considered data subjects. I mean, the school concludes specific service agreements with you, and personal information may be contained within those documents. So very importantly, first of all, do you have consent for the processing of information? If you don't have consent, we can consider whether the processing is necessary in terms of a contract the data subject is a party to. I know a lot of schools with school hostels will conclude contracts with a data subject, with a parent who enrolls his or her child in the school hostel. They might give you medical information about the learner, and then you may process that information if you have regulated in the contract that if that child would get ill, that you may take the child to a doctor and give the doctor the medical history of the child. Yes, thirdly, there's a legal obligation to perform the processing. A very common example would be if you look at school fee exemptions. Parents would now apply for school fee exemptions, and you now have an obligation to process the information within the school fee exemption regulations. So that's an example of when you may process information in that regard. The protection of a legitimate interest of the data subject. We'll get to some practical examples a bit later on that point, but sometimes it might be necessary for you as a school to, and we've talked about the access to information on the first slide, but sometimes it might be necessary for you to make information available because the data subject has a legitimate interest to protect, they have to protect. It might be a duty by a public body. And then finally, the processing is necessary to pursue the legitimate interest of the data controller or a third party. Now, let's look at the parent not paying school fees now. So now it might be necessary for you to hand over that parent to a debt collector or to your attorney, because you now have a legitimate interest to protect. So then you may process information legally within the POPIA Act. So yeah, the specific rules when we look at the processing of personal information is contained in Section 35 of the Act. Now, Section 34 specifically states that as a rule you shouldn't be processing it, but we know that schools mostly process personal information of children. So we now have to consider what the rules are, which the schools must abide by. So you may process personal information if it's carried out with prior consent. So in this regard, it is very important to look at a consent that the parents must complete at the beginning of the year or when they enroll the learner. FEDSAS drafted a draft consent form which you can use, and we do encourage you to adopt it and make sure that that it would talk to your school's needs, so that you make sure that you get the consent from the parents to process information of the learners and of the children. And secondly, if it's necessary to uphold rights and obligations, if it's necessary to comply with an obligation of international public law for historical, statistical, or research purposes. We know not so long ago, a few years back, South Africa went throughout the country and they collected specific statistics with regards to the people of South Africa, looking at our geographics and so on and so on. So there might be you might collect the information for such a reason, and then finally information has been deliberately made public by the child with the consent of a competent person. So if you say, and if we say it was made public deliberately, we mustn't forget about our social media platforms. Sometimes we do post information and we do share personal information through these platforms, and I must emphasize that if you make personal information of yourself available in the public domain, that you then can't later on require of someone to respect your privacy or to withhold specific information or to not use the information if you've made it public voluntarily. So please remember and please use social media responsibly. Information which are in the public domain is not always regarded as private and personal. So please do remember that. Okay, so if we look at the processing of personal information in schools, I've identified a few categories which I would like to look at, and this is where I want to get a bit more practical. In light of the theory that we've seen now, and in line of the rules that we've seen now, we're going to start looking at the physical processing of information. So we're going to look at the collection and use, data transmission and distribution. We know that schools communicate to parents that they do have social media or Facebook pages through which they communicate and share information. Also important, storage and disposal of data. I know of classrooms which are full of personal information. We have a lot of papers, test papers, exam papers. You might have learner profiles within your classrooms. Any personal information that you can think of. And so we have to remember now that POPIA prescribes to us how we must go about when we store and when we dispose data. And then finally, the updating and modification of data. It's important for us to, when we work with information, that we have to be transparent in the way we use it, and we have to make sure that it is up to date. And if you get queries from a parent or from whoever who is legally entitled to the information, you can provide updated data and information. Okay, so let's look at the collection and use. So what are the rules? There's a few questions that you have to ask yourself, and you have to be able to answer positively before you collect and use the information. And the first one is the purpose specification. Do you know what you need the information for? So before you start collecting information, you have to have the goal and the reason why you need the information at hand, and you have to be open with the persons, with the learners and your parents when you collect the information, to say, this is what we need the information for. Secondly, the justification. Are you allowed to use the information for this purpose? You might have collected information for a specific purpose, let's say, for instance, to send the children on a choir tour. But now for some other reason, you've collected the information for a specific purpose here. The question now is whether you may use the information for any other purpose. You might now receive a query or a request from someone outside of the school for specific information. So very important, what is your justification for the information? You may only use it for the purpose which you have collected it. Minimal processing. Are you only collecting what you need? In POPIA, we can also comply by default. So only collect what you need, because then there's a lot fewer and a lot less safety measures that you do have to implement to protect the personal information which you collect. And then finally, transparency. Are you being open about what you collect and what you use it for? So the question here is, if people are surprised about you processing the information, then you're not acting transparent in the use and the collection of those information. So please remember these 4 questions that you must be able to answer in the positive. Okay, so if we look at data transmission and distribution, and here's where I want to get a bit practical and refer to specific situations within schools. Now, first of all, I've included here on our right an orange block, and that's the rules that we have to abide when processing personal information of children, because I'm mostly going to refer to the processing of personal information of children now. And I'm going to kick off with social media, and we're going to test it on the orange block to see whether we are in line and we may process the information as required by the POPIA Act. So when we look at social media, I know there's a lot of schools who has WhatsApp groups. Now, I don't know if there's someone from Swaziland tuned in today, but for some reason, if something happened on WhatsApp, either the hockey group or the great art teacher who shared a photo, if there was something, a scandal or something on WhatsApp, the chances are good that it came from Swaziland. But that being said, I think the lessons learned from those incidents is that we, first of all, very importantly, have to consider the information which we distribute on WhatsApp or through social media. If it is of a personal nature, if it is personal information as defined in the POPIA Act, we have to ask the questions before we start distributing the information on these platforms, whether we have the consent to do so, or whether it's a right or obligation in terms of legislation to do so. You can ask the questions as it is contained in the orange block. That's the first aspect. If it's not personal information, please feel free to communicate with your parents, with your staff, through the social media. And then secondly, I think it's very important that we have to look at how we communicate through these platforms. We must remember, and I'm going to use an email as an example. Sometimes without even realizing it, we are sharing and we are spreading personal information. For instance, let's say I want to send a group email, and I'm negligent and I CC everyone, I don't blind copy everyone. Then by implication, I'm spreading and I'm sharing personal information by inserting the email addresses of everyone that I want to send the email to. I'm now sharing and spreading the personal information in that manner. So it's very important to always remember to act responsibly when you communicate on such a platform. Make sure that you blind copy and not just copy. And the same goes for your WhatsApp groups. If you can rather create a broadcasting group where the personal information of a person is hidden, please make sure that you go about and do it in that manner, because by just adding a lot of parents or a lot of children to a group, you might caught yourselves in a bit of a pickle by then simply by default then sharing a lot of personal information of people who do not necessarily want their personal information to be shared with others. Okay, that's our communication on WhatsApp and via email. I think it's very important to now turn to Facebook or Instagram. And for me, I really enjoy to see what the schools are up to, and I think it's nice to brag about the accomplishments of your learners and so forth. But we have to remember now that the implications of POPI is that we now just can't go ahead and share photos as we like on these platforms because it's the sharing of personal information. So if we turn to the orange block again now, we have to ask ourselves, and for this purpose, you would then definitely need the consent of the parents before you start sharing photos and publishing accomplishments through your Facebook. So please make sure, once again, visit our FEDSAS website where we do have a draft consent form specifically for this purpose. Make sure that you do get the permission from your parents. And I know this is a great administrative burden which is now placed on schools, but unfortunately that's the implications of POPI now. We can't just go ahead and share information as we like. If I can just share a real life situation that we've had to deal with at FEDSAS, is we know of a learner that was removed from his biological parents because he was neglected at home, and he was placed in a safe space with new parents, and that child was enrolled with another school. So that school didn't realize what the whole situation is, and they published photos of the child on their social media. Long story short, the biological parents could then track back to the child, and he didn't have a happy ending. So there are some merit within POPI, but it places a great administrative burden on schools now. In our newsletters, the same applies, the same rules apply. The same way we communicate through social media, you have to now apply to your newsletters. If your newsletters goes through DS6, please make sure and check whether the content that is contained in your newsletter, make sure that it is not of a personal nature. And then unfortunately, we sometimes do get information, or we have to deal with learners who are neglected or who are being abused at home. So the question now is, how do we deal with this kind of situations? May we share the information that we receive in this regard with, say, for instance, the SAPD or social development or whoever? And yes, in that regard, we can tick the second box. Legislation requires of educators who are aware of these types of situations to report it. So it is a requirement in terms of law. So yes, then you may process the information and you may report it to specific institutions as is prescribed by law. Okay, COVID. We've had COVID now, and I think everyone is dealing with COVID like a machine now. We've received, as we receive our learners back to school, we know we have to take the temperature. We have that questionnaire that we have to have the learners complete. So through that, we are also collecting data. We are also processing personal information as defined by the POPI Act. And that is fine because it is also prescribed by legislation. Legislation prescribes to us to collect those information. Very importantly, we now have to make sure that if we record the information and when we store the information, we have to make sure that it is stored in a safe place. And then, of course, I'm not sure if you are lucky enough that you haven't had a positive COVID incident in your school. If you did have, I think you would be well aware of all of the parents going into a panic, and they now demand to know the identity of the person who tested positive. In this regard, I have to point out that once again, the legislation would dictate to us and guide us as to how do we go about in processing this information. The school do have an obligation to report to the Department of Health who the positive COVID-19 incident is, and then the department will take it from there. The department will do the tracing of the persons and make contact with the persons who might have been in contact with a positive COVID-19 case. So very importantly, please don't go about and share the information in your newsletters and on your front page, and which reads COVID-19 case of the week is so-and-so. No. You have to follow the guidelines and still move within the prescripts of the law in that regard as well. And then, of course, we'd like to brag with our learners. A lot of schools share and like to share the top 10 academic achievers, and they would like to put up the information in school to motivate other learners to also work hard. Please remember that's also forms also part of processing of personal information. And once again, you have to be able to tick one of those boxes before you may process the information in such a manner. So yeah, what if you could sever the connection? What do I mean with and by this? So basically, if you can separate the subject, the data subject, from their personal information, it might be possible for you to freely process that information. But it's important we have to distinguish between pseudonymization and anonymization. So if we look at anonymization, it means that we completely destroy the identifying information. So it is irreversible, and you cannot trace the information back to the data subject. Now, if that is the case, then yes, you can make the information public. But if it is reversible, if we look at pseudonymization, and you can trace the information back to a specific person, then you may not make the information public. Let's give you an example. Let's say next year for your fundraising activity, you're looking for a specific theme, you're sending a questionnaire to all of your parents, and you're not requiring the parents to insert their name or surname or personal information. You're just asking for a suggestion for a specific theme, and you collect those information, then it's very clear. You have separated the personal information from the data subject, and then you may make the results freely available to all of the other parents. So very important. We must also ask and look at how your consent from your parents must look like. Importantly, it must be freely given. It must be reversible, meaning your parent must be able to detract his or her consent or permission for something. The information, the consent must be given, it must be informed, meaning you can't put a gun against someone's head enthusiastically. It means you can't put a gun against someone's head and say, give me the consent now. It must be enthusiastically and freely given. If we look at it, and if we say the information, the consent must be informed, it means that you must know specifically what you are giving consent for. And then lastly, specific goes hand in hand with informed. You give consent to the specific processing of the personal information. Yeah, if we look at the storage and disposal of records, I like the 2 rules. Number 1, shred it, don't spread it. And secondly, use it or lose it. Very importantly, if we look at the disposal of records, by simply throwing it away is not sufficient anymore, because someone can come by your school, go through your garbage and still find the information. Please remember that the delete button on your computer doesn't delete anything. The information still lies in your school's recycle bin. So if you want to delete information which is of an electronic version on your computer, make sure that you delete it completely. Information that might be specifically within your in your classroom, we have to start looking at private storage. Do you have a filing cabinet that can lock? Specifically, if you do have a personal profile of a learner in your possession with information containing information such as your medical history, psychological tests, and so on, that's information that you do want to safeguard. Removable storage. If you have information on your USB stick, please make sure you encrypt them. That's something that can very easily be lost or stolen. And then finally, printers and scanners. Please make sure that when you have your scanners and your printers removed from your school, that the memory is totally wiped. But I'm sure that your school, if they haven't already appointed a committee, but your school will have to come up with specific measures to ensure that we go about to safeguard the information. Record management, you may only keep records for the following purposes. Number one, if legislation requires it. Now, attached to our POPIA policy on our website, we have a list of legislation and the term for which the legislation requires you to keep specific records. If it is needed for operational requirements, you have a contract which states you may require it, and you have consent to do it. So very importantly, do you know what you need and for how long you need to keep it? So just to conclude, I think listening to all the requirements of the POPIA Act, one might feel a bit, I don't know how we're going to comply with this act, and we only have 12 months to do so. I think it's important to just reflect on why we are doing what we are doing. First of all, our personal information and the trust in the school when processing the information are assets. We do want our parents and our learners to trust that we are acting and processing responsibly. We want to protect the reputation of our school. We've read this week and last week of Experian Credit Bureau, which were hacked, and almost 24 million South Africans' personal information, which is now out there with someone. So we want to protect the reputation of our school. As information governance leads to compliance, compliance leads to saving, increased productivity, and better decision making. I just want to make the school's budget process, which is around the corner, as an example. If you have proper information, you can make proper decisions when you budget for your coming year. Because it's an opportunity to be socially responsible. We want to be social responsible South African residents. So that's an opportunity for us to do so. And then finally, it doesn't have to stop at personal information. We can act responsibly throughout the processing of any information that we do receive. So Paul, on that note, I'd like to hand over back to you to just ask if there are any questions.
There are indeed some questions, but I've got a bit of a problem at the moment, and that my computer is closing down. So you might have to just fill the questions from the Q&A box. You can probably hear me. I don't know if I've been disconnected.
Yes, no, not a problem. Let me, I'll quickly kick off from the Q&A box. As I said earlier, if the information is received from the public domain, you may go ahead and process the information. I do think, seeing as we are now in the COVID-19 time, and it can easily cause panic. I think it is important for you to slow down the spread of the information and make sure that it doesn't create further panic, that that the information is reported through the correct channels before you report it, just to verify that it is the correct information, and then just follow the legislation as it is prescribed. So I definitely say there's a great responsibility on educators to make sure that we act responsibly with the information governance.
Okay. Thanks, Shana. Thanks for popping that. And there were just some questions that I've got on the screen now. There was 3 questions. I think we spoke about taking pictures, and there's a question a bit later about pictures. And I think we maybe need to explain where we sit. I mean, previously, I think what schools did, if I can summarize it, is send out a letter, or at your agreement to pay school fees letter, there's a little clause that says you give consent for the pictures to be taken and to be used for marketing purposes. I think the general thought process, or the general questions that are being asked is that still valid? Is that going to be a problem going forward? Can we still handle pictures along that sort of line, along that sort of basis? The next slide also talks about that, but in relationship to Facebook. So where do we sit with pictures, Jean? Pictures that we take from learners and the distribution thereof, using them in the local newspaper, on Facebook, in the Howick Buzz, or whatever it might be. Where do we sit with that?
Yeah, Paul, I think it's very important for the school, but it might be a job for your school management team to just go sit around the table and make a list of where we use personal information and what we use it for. Specifically, because schools are dealing with the personal information of learners, I think it is important so that when a parent enrolls a child into your school, you can give the parent a list and say, we're going to need a picture, and it is for this purpose. We would like to brag about our children, and we are going to publish photos within the school's magazine or make it available on our webpage. So we are requesting your permission to go ahead. So I think that's important, Paul, to get that in order now, to make sure that when a child is enrolled in your school, specifically when you start publishing photos and so on. So unfortunately, in terms of POPI, you do need to go through that process, and you do need that consent. And if I can jump over to the next question. So the consent, it's only required that if the parent gives consent, that is 100%. You don't need to have the consent of the parent and the learner, seeing as the learners are still minors. Unless it's a matric learner who's already turned 18, the matric learner themselves can give consent or give permission to something. But otherwise, the consent is required by the parent or someone appointed or who is legally allowed to act on behalf of the parent. So that's where we stand on that one.
School fee by debit order, can this be enforced? Okay, I think the actual payment, the question is more the supply of the information behind the process. Yeah, can we force parents to pay? Well, we can't force them to pay via debit order, but you can ask them to pay via debit order. And I think by giving information, they're supplying consent to use that information for the right use. I think that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely, Paul. Usually, if you want a debit order to go down, you would require the parent to give you the information and to sign a permission form that you can log that debit order with the bank. So it's 100% permissible. You can still go ahead with debit orders. It's just important that you do have the consent of the parent to carry on with the debit order, and to important as well to get the permission from the parent to distribute or to share that information with a specific bank to register that debit order as well. So that goes on as normal. You can't force a parent to do so, but you can, if they are willing to do it freely, you can go ahead. Yeah.
Facebook question that came up, and I know you spoke obviously about Facebook, but who is responsible for the Facebook posts? And once again, we spoke about consent. The holder of the Facebook account is responsible. Who's responsible, Rane?
Yeah, definitely. Paul, I think it's important, and this is also where it's to the drawing board. You don't want too many persons posting on Facebook. It's important for you as a school when you want to responsibly govern information. The school or the SMT or the SGB will have to appoint 1 or 2 or 3 persons who are solely responsible for posting information on your social media, so you can regulate the information being posted, and that those persons exactly and specifically understands the requirements of POPI and when they may post and what they may post. I think it is you're walking a thin line if you start posting left and right, and you're allowing any education or any personnel within your school to post on Facebook. You have to appoint 1 or 2 persons who would take responsibility for that.
Okay. We covered that when I disappeared and you came back. I heard you were covering that as well. There were a few questions that were typed in, and I just want to go through the one. There's a really good question that I think we're all wondering. How do we prove that you are POPI or Papaya compliant?
Okay, well, Paul, first of all, and the information regulator is still working on that. One of the requirements is that you have to register your school and your information officer with the information regulator. So I'm going to cover that in next week's session. But that doesn't guarantee that you are complying with POPI. That just shows you are abiding by the specific rule of POPI by registering. But the information regulator can monitor, and it is possible for a data subject to report the school or to report someone at the school to the information regulator, who may then investigate the actions being taken at your school, and then they will see whether you are complying with POPI or not. So I think that's important. We do have a policeman who's going to watch over you to see if you are complying with POPI.
And I think the real problem comes in is when you are not compliant and you are found wanting to be compliant. So I think that is also the big thing, that the risks and the fines that come through with lack of compliance when you are found out is a deterrent itself. There's just a follow-up question on the note of consent. If consent is given by a parent, what does a school do if a parent reverses that consent?
Yeah, oh, that's the challenge of POPI, and that makes it so difficult, is you now have this administrative burden to check whether there is consent, whether it was reversed, because if that consent was reversed, you may no longer use that information for the purpose which it was collected in the first place. So then you may not use that photographs anymore to go about your marketing. So I think we have to look at our strategies if we want to market our school through photos of learners. So unfortunately, that's the implications of POPI. You can't go ahead and use the information further.
And then just a follow-up onto that, and I'll just paraphrase it a bit. If consent has been retracted, is the school then responsible for removing any posts that were made while the consent was given? I would presume that while a consent was given, you could use those pictures. If it's now been withdrawn, you can't really get rid of it. I mean, digitally is there forever. You can't get rid of it, but you can stop posting any new pictures from that point onwards.
Yeah, no, definitely, Paul. Once it's posted and it's in outer space or on the digital platform, it's very difficult to retract it, unless it is a parent requests you to remove a specific picture of a learner. Then please, then please do so. But if there's hundreds of thousands of pictures already out there, it would be a challenge. And I mean, when you process that and posted it, you did act within the POPI guidelines and regulations. So then that's a risk that one will have to take. Paul, unfortunately, we won't be able to comply with POPI fully 100%, because we know we have the risks of parents taking pictures during sporting days, and they might publish photos. So I think it's important to identify your greatest risks and try and regulate those risks, and then don't sweat the small stuff.
Two more questions at the moment, and I think there might still be some more. School has appointed two external marketers with photographs of children, events, etc., to generate posts and videos. Is there anything we should expect from them, from the marketers, in terms of a contract, protection of this information? The parents have already given consent for pictures to be used.
Okay, I'm glad to hear the parents has already given the permission. That's 100%. Just make sure that they are aware that the information is being shared with the third party. And then now POPIA requires us to conclude an agreement between yourself as the school and between the third party to whom you have outsourced the processing of the information, to have or to get the guarantee from the third party that they will also comply with the POPIA requirements, and they also have the necessary safety measures in place. So please check on the FEDSAS website. We do have a service provider agreement in place. Also, please make use of that and make sure that you do put an agreement in place.
Two more questions on consent. It looks like we're going to have to run a whole webinar on consent of photographs. How do you keep record of whom you do not give permission to share Papaya in a school of 1,500 learners? For example, a few parents do not give permission to post photographs or photos of a game, and learners from other schools are in the photograph as well. It is, and if I can answer it, it is a very difficult process, but you do need to be systematic about it. Yes, I hear what you say, Andre. 1,500 learners, you've got to try and manage that. I've always done the calculation with the school as a chairman to say, in actual fact, you can multiply that by 10 at least, that we've got subject matters that you've got to consider. But I think start by Jeanne, maybe start by your own school first. Make sure you know who you can take photos of in your own school environment first and manage it from that side.
Yeah, no, for sure. Paul, now I know Andre here from Bloemfontein. I think it's the biggest primary school in the Free State. So I know they have a lot of learners. Andre, now I don't have a direct answer for you on that one. I think, yeah, it's as I've said, it would be an administrative nightmare to keep track of that. So I think practically we will have to get our minds thinking on how we're going to deal with this. But what I can say is that that's the requirement of POPIA, and we do have to comply with that. You might just have one difficult parent who is now like a gutful at the school, and they might just make it the life a bit difficult for you. But no, practically, now we'll test it out and see if we can get some ideas from schools on how they're going to deal with it. But no, it would be an administrative nightmare.
I do see people are raising their hand. I presume that is because they're leaving. But there are two other very important questions that I'd like to still pose to you. Does consent have to be obtained from the parents every year, or can the consent span a full-time period that the learner is at the school?
Now, I'm comfortable if with enrollment you get the permission. That's fine for me. Just specifically specify that you are going to use it for the whole term that the learner are enrolled with the school, or is enrolled with the school. And then if you then afterwards need additional information, you'll then just send an additional consent form and collect the information in such a manner.
Okay, online learning is a particular challenge, both for the educators and the children in respect of data collection. Can an educator refuse to be videoed, for example, while giving a lesson, or for that lesson to be used at a later time? So, I would love to really have Rian Vandenberg on board. Yeah, he was at the earlier session. As big drivers don't do things twice if you can do it once. But what happens if an educator refuses to be videoed?
Well, yeah, Paul, that's the right of the educator to refuse. But I think it's important to explain, have a talk with that educator. This is what is required of you to fulfill your duties, and it isn't it's not, it is reasonable of the school to expect that of you. Yeah, Paul, no, and I wish Rian was here, but I think no, it would be reasonable of the employer to request of you to record the class, specifically considering the times that we are living in now, and that we do need to get the children educated. So, just have a talk with that educator and see, ask the reasoning why not.
Yeah, I suppose it comes down to job description changing and job description altering. And maybe I'll say it tongue in cheek. And I know I'm speaking to educators. I love educators, so I'm not saying this in a bad way. Otherwise, you've got to teach the same lesson over and over and over and over again. So this is a way of getting your services duplicated without you having to be in there more. But I agree. I think that's probably the discussion that needs to take place. I think that's about it as far as the questions that I've seen come through. I think we've handled most of them. If we haven't, folks, please feel free to get hold of us. If there are any other questions, there are lots of questions, and probably at this stage more questions than there are entirely in answers. But we obviously are working hard behind the scenes to make sure that we get as many of the answers in place as possible so that we can help you in your processes going forward. I just want to finish off by letting you know about our future webinars, and thanks for everybody's patience. We are running some webinars next week again. We're talking about governance and management meeting processes, in particular governing bodies for the next year. We need to start planning for that. We've got a very interesting member in the Center of Technology that's going to talk to us about telecoms and connectivity in schools. And then, as Jean mentioned, we're talking to information managers, guiding information managers as what they need to do with regards to the information process. The last two there are still in development and they keep changing. We seem to have lots of information coming in through various networks with regards to where we're going with racial harmony and transformation in schools. Briefly just point you to our website and all the details. I've dropped a few links in the chat box as well. And I will obviously now, you'll see our details as well. Please get hold of our provincial managers, wherever they may be or wherever you may be. Get in touch with them and ask them more information. And then finally, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being on board with us. I'm just going to have a quick look down at the chat box and see there's just some thank yous, or more importantly, I must say there are some thank yous, which we do appreciate. So those are down there. And then I'm just going to ask Jeanne just to finish off. I know she's been speaking a lot. She's been here Afrikaans and English session. But thank you very much, Jeanne, for giving up your birthday. As I said before, not the new generation that takes a holiday when they have a birthday, because I hear that's becoming a thing, or maybe it has become a thing. But thank you very much for sacrificing your afternoon and for giving us this vital information to get us online. I think the big thing, folks, the message that I take home is it's not just someone else's job to look after information. It's kind of everybody's job to look after information. And you can't just say, well, someone else must do it. Yes, someone is going to compile the guide and the documentation and manage that side. But we also need to be responsible with information. We need to be personally responsible with our personal information to protect it as well. Jeanne, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. You've summarized it beautifully. So I'm not going to say much, just that I'm going to enjoy my little glass of wine now this afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Take care from my side, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jeanne. Bye.